Hi, I'm Marc Leff, Yale College class of '93. I'm an architect, and I am pleased to be here with Jasmit Singh Rangr, who was a classmate of mine and who's also an architect, and happily enough, was also my flatmate for the first year of our post-Yale College lives. Welcome, Jasmit.
Thank you. Good to see you, Mark.
So Jasmit, it's been probably 25 years since I saw you. We obviously knew each other very well back in the day. I'm curious how your life has progressed and how your architecture career has progressed since we were first starting out all those years ago.
Yeah, it's been a long time. And that really does fly. Who would have thought? But what happened after we roomed together? We both lived in Soho. You worked for Deborah Berke, where now you're a partner, and I worked for Mario Gandelsonis, who's a professor at Princeton. And then I went back to grad school at Yale and spent 3 more years in New Haven. And as soon as that was done, came straight back to New York. I worked for 3 firms over, I think it was just about 6 years. And then I started my own. It's a little more complicated because there were visa deadlines. And so, going back to school had to happen that year because of a 1-year practical training visa that expired. And so I went to grad school, and then the work visas kept me employed under employers. And then finally I was able to get self-sponsor my own visa and started a corporation called Rangr Studio on the advice of my lawyer, actually. And then I got a few little projects, one from a friend, some off of the internet. Back then, Google AdWords had just started, and I did an experiment and actually got a few clients that way. And that led to more. And I spent until 2016 in New York. And then because of a promotion that my partner could not turn down, we moved to the Bay Area and restarted practice, and was lucky to be able to be next to the University of California, Berkeley, and very lucky to be able to get a part-time teaching job there.
I'm curious to hear how moving after so many years in New York work with your studio and the projects you're doing, and obviously now you're teaching as well.
Yeah, it was, I thought I'd be able to keep, when we moved, I still had projects that were finishing up in New York. I mean, they were, still had a year left of construction. So I was flying back a lot. Just like you, I was sort of flying once a month, at least, if not twice a month. And so that kept me in New York in a certain way, but it was very hectic. And then for whatever reason, things sort of slowed down. Maybe it was because I wasn't in New York and around my client base. And that gave me the opportunity to sort of think like, okay, what do I want to do? And that gave me the idea of, well, maybe I can do a little bit of teaching, because I've always thought that would be part of my life. But with the sort of rushed life of New York, you start something and then you do everything you can just to keep it going, because if you don't, it fails. So, so it was sort of an enforced break. I mean, work kept coming, but it wasn't I wasn't as busy as before. And then having been here now for a few years, things have picked up. And I think also the various political climates and economic climates have changed and stabilized a little bit. And so now I've got work on the East Coast again, more than I had before, and work on the West Coast. So it's become busier than ever before now.
Well, I always knew you to be, very a very sort of intellectual kind of architect. You're very intelligent, and I always thought it would be very natural for you to teach and practice architecture. It's very common. Most people probably don't realize it, how many architects practice and teach. It's, I don't teach, but it's very natural to me that you teach. So how do you think teaching impacts your work your practice of architecture, which is something I'm curious about since I don't do it.
It's been interesting. The chair of the department sort of threw me in the deep end when I got started, and so suddenly I was teaching third-year graduate students with 20 years of not being around the academy.
Right.
It was just deeply scary. But now it's been 3 years, and I'm about to teach my fourth class next semester, back to writing my own syllabus. I've been teaching fundamental of architecture design, which to now for the last 2 years, which is a class that is the first studio design class that undergraduates take. And I found that to be very clarifying, in that when you're teaching someone how you know how to do something, you've done it for 20, we've done it for 30 years now, 25 years, whatever it's been, and we know it. We just don't even think about how is it that we are doing what we're doing. And you have to understand that to be able to teach. So in a way, it makes me go back and think about the design process very specifically and very distinctly, and then to try and distill what of that I can get across in the first semester. And so I think the summary of what it has meant is that it's very clarifying. It makes me rethink how I'm doing what I'm doing, while I'm thinking about how to teach someone how to do something like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I've talked to other people who teach in other fields, or give lectures in other fields, and they talk about how important it is, how you really have to know a subject well and clearly in your mind to be able to explain it to people who don't know about it, or who are not, not as expert in it as you are. And it's really interesting. So I mean, can you give an example of maybe how on a project, how that's maybe your design process has changed? Literally,
well, just as
sketching
you said,
or designing.
Just as you said, the people you've spoken to have said you really need to know a subject to teach it. But and I feel like at this point, we've been doing this so long, we have that expertise. Well, the most interesting part was having to give a short lecture on Louis Kahn, who, as Yalees who grew up with Vincent Scully teaching us the history of architecture, we know Louis Kahn, right? Grew up around his buildings, we've been in them. As Scully sort of correctly says, his first and last buildings are in New Haven on Chapel Street, facing each other. But in putting that lecture together, I had to think about the subject matter as a designer. And so it made me realize much more deeply what was at stake with the sort of geometry exercises that were certainly were part, I think, of his projects ever since he partnered with Ann Ting, who was obsessed with geometry. And so I find myself now drawing something and thinking, well, what is the underlying geometry behind this? Sometimes to a fault, does there need to be underlying geometry behind this? But it starts to, again, sort of clarify. It adds a level of clarity to a design that I think is growing.
Yeah. Well, it kind of puts, it imposes sort of self-discipline on you as a creative person, as a designer, to really, purify the design, get clarity on your design thinking. Because, architecture is long and messy and complicated and deals with a lot of people. So there's a lot of distractions from what we really like to do, which is design things. Can you, I want to change gears for a second, maybe talk about pre-Yale days, from the time before we met. You grew up in the UK and India, and now you lived obviously in Connecticut and New York and now the Bay Area. Can you talk about how the places you have lived, and especially the places where you grew up, because I'm really interested in kind of those formative years on us as adults have impacted you as a designer and impacted your work designing buildings?
Yeah, so my parents were in the Indian Navy, and so we grew up on naval bases, which meant a lot of moving around.
Mm-hmm.
And while the climates of southern India where we lived were sort of similar,
Mm-hmm.
we also had family up north, which is a different climate, especially in winter. And and then the move to England was much more dramatic. And
Mm-hmm.
what I noticed, especially in that more dramatic move, was how the architecture really changed, and how spaces
Mm-hmm.
that had been very exterior focused and very ambiguous in their line between interior and exterior suddenly became very interior focused and had
Mm-hmm.
a sort of hermetic membrane around them as
Mm-hmm.
building outline. And so that really stayed with me. And then the climate of the Northeast, New England, is very much different in that the summers are actually hot, unlike
Mm-hmm.
UK. And so there's a transition. There are these transition spaces that then are similar to, the naval bases in India, kind of 40s, 50s modernist architecture bungalows with
Mm-hmm.
huge terraces, and it's a very different kind of idea than the porch of New England, which
Mm-hmm.
contains sort of the internal embrace of warmth in the
Mm-hmm.
winter, and allows for that transitional space between for the summer where you can be in
Mm-hmm.
shade. And so, for in our career, I think Frank Gehry won the Pritzker Prize in 1989, which is when we started
Mm-hmm.
college. And Zaha Hadid won in 2004, which is when I started my own firm. And so I feel like my architectural formative years were bookended by two very
Mm-hmm.
expressionist architects, for whom I think the object mattered more than the form. The form of the object mattered more than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I was starting out, I thought, well, how do you decide what form to make?
Mm-hmm.
And that those early years mixed with one of my critics in graduate school introduced me to the work of land artists in the 60s and 70s.
Mm-hmm.
These gigantic constructions out in the middle of the Mexican desert, for example, that had everything to do with creating space or place by responding to landscape.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, the projects sort of evolve out of their landscape and site and their climate. And so I think that early kind of shock of seeing how spaces changed within different climates always stayed with me, and sort of came out into how I approach.
I mean, your work is so beautiful, and what you said about the role of climate, say in southern India, and how it affects spaces and architecture and formal expression versus the same issues in New England, really brings to mind some of the projects that you have on your website, like a house in the Dominican Republic, and some projects in upstate New York. And they're very different, but they're both so attuned to their landscapes, and obviously to their climates, in terms of indoor space and outdoor space. And I'm really impressed by how different, but also how similar they are. They each address the landscape and the climate in their own way, but really distinctly. And I'm curious how your process designing a project actually gets the architecture so in tune with the landscape. I mean, you lived in India. I mean, is it about the places where you've lived and experienced, or do you get more sort of familiar or intimate with the actual site where the project's located?
Well, first of all, thank you for those compliments. They mean a lot coming from someone of your achievements and experience. So it's, the first thing that I do is get a site plan and put the position of the sun on it, and winter sunrise and summer sunrise and sunsets on the plan. So that starts to inform where certain spaces want to face, how much heat you want to get in there, how much you want to keep it cool. And then it gets more intimate to the actual site, like where is the view, where are the prevailing breezes, how do you, it's interesting in this climate, I got to build my own house in Berkeley, which was the kind of enticement that got me to move from New York. And it was a kind of a miracle that it all happened, and lucky, but what happened, this is a kind of a chilly microclimate in the hills of Berkeley. And so thinking about, and we have a view out to the bay, which is sort of in the wrong direction as far as the sun goes, because you don't want that hot sun heating up your space. But the microclimate made it such that I designed this glass box that would actually get overheated by the sun during the day, knowing that if you can create cross ventilation in a dry climate, you cool the space down very quickly. And so using cross ventilation techniques, the chimney effect and glazing that's right up against the envelope of the building, you could actually create this living room never needs to be heated. And when I get cold down here in my office, I go up there for a few minutes and warm up in my greenhouse. The added benefit is my chili plants are finally growing. But it's really, it starts with sun position, and then it's every little intimate thing you can find out about the actual site itself.
So can you talk a little more about the project you did in the Dominican Republic, which is just so stunning?
Oh, thank you.
And did you spend time there? Did you walk the site? Was it one visit? What was that process like?
That was an early project. That was I started that in 2005 or 6. So that was only a year or two after I started my firm. It was very scary. There were a lot of site visits. Luckily, the client really wanted to do something hyper local. He didn't want to import anything, mostly to avoid the kinds of problems you run into. And so we also both of us wanted to get to know people there to see how we could make this happen, who are the suppliers, who are the contractors. And so we spent a lot of time on the site. We really got to know it. And we got input from people who lived in that town. One of whom later told me, that windy point on that cliff, I never thought anyone would ever build anything there. But we kind of took advantage of that wind to flow over the pool and cool the living spaces. And that design evolved over a year. And the various elements would move around on the site. And there was a point at which I realized that the site sloped down about 5 feet across 200, but that actually became a way of landscaping the site such that when you arrived at the actual entrance, you were elevated above the ground plane just with the view in front of you. And so in that way, that intimacy of knowing the site created a much larger effect, but it's this combination, as you know, of juggling big picture, big ideas, and being able to integrate these smaller, more intimate moments in a way that pulls them together more powerfully. Does that seems like very architecture speaking?
Well, why do you? I mean, just to ask you a more philosophical question, why do you think designing projects that are so attuned to their sites and their ecologies matters to you, or matters to architecture, and is not the kind of formalism of Frank Gehry or Zaha Hadid, who you cited before as being kind of the role models during our formative years?
Well, I don't know if they were role models to us necessarily, but they were
exactly
the prevailing.
They were the prevailing
personalities.
Models, yes.
Yeah. I think it matters in the way that you define what architecture is. And over these years, I've come to an understanding of architecture sort of as an augmentation of an existing place.
Mhm.
And so in that way, we have something that's already somewhat habitable. And I feel that what we do as architects is augment that existing environment to make it more habitable for us.
Mhm.
So that I think is especially important in these days of increasing climate crisis,
Mhm.
where working with what you have rather than on top of what you have, or even sometimes against what you have,
Mhm.
seems a more appropriate response.
Mhm. Well, yeah, I mean, it's very interesting because I think a lot of people think that architects, they design in a style, um, or they choose a style, or they design formal things, forms. But what you're describing, I think, is the best kind of architecture, which is architecture that is responsive to the needs of a place, the customs of a place, and especially the climate and the landscape and the ecology, so that you a building that is in upstate New York, cannot exist on an island in the Caribbean. I mean, it's just
Well, sometimes they do,
I
but they
mean,
don't fit
sometimes they
very well.
do, but it should not.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, the spaces you occupy, the buildings you occupy, they should reinforce where you are, which sort of brings me to another question. Do you travel a lot, and do you find inspiration? I mean, obviously you've traveled a lot in your life, but do you find inspiration traveling, or are there other things you do that you kind of inspire you as an architect?
I travel a lot less now than I used to.
Yeah, well, I think we all do, but
I think there's some pent up demand, for sure. Travel is always such a mind clearer.
Yeah.
And I feel like even that time on the plane, you think about things, and new ideas come to you. So just the very act of moving from place to place is, I'm sure you know very well, from all of your back and forth. But yeah, going to new places is always terrific. But even going to the same places, as long as they're away from home, like we go visit a beach in France with my father every summer. And it's the same place, it's the same beach, but every year you see it slightly differently, and you climate that much more, or adapt to it that much better. For sure, travel. I think that, I have a whole bunch of books on land artists and these kind of large scale interventions. It's really interesting to see more art that's based on Native American traditions, for example, and other indigenous traditions around the world come to the forefront, because I think those are ancient ways of living in an ecology, as you put it very well, that are so much more profound than we have been taught, or bothered to look at. And so those, I think, are inspiring as well, especially also from a social justice front too.
Well, they're I mean, looking at the sort of roots or history of architecture in a place is so enlightening. And I've always been inspired by this Bernard Rudofsky book, Architect Without Architects. Architecture Without Architects. Because it really shows that this tradition of responding to the climate, responding to the landscape, responding to our needs, it goes back since as long as humans have been building things. That's why humans build things. We all look forward to traveling a little bit more and getting a little more inspiration, I think. I think my last question is probably one that you get asked a lot. I know I do, but what's your dream project, or what's your dream client? What would you really like to do?
Have you ever had a satisfactory answer to that question?
No. I'm not the one that has to answer that right
now. Honestly, I don't have one. What's happening now is I'm doing a little tiny project for the Berkeley Chess School, which is a very deserving nonprofit. And it's honestly a window and a lobby, but it's so satisfying. Just started, hoping to start a project for Habitat for Humanity. Again, a small project, but 3 affordable housing units in a tiny, tiny lot. And putting all of the work, all that's been learned from 20 years of work now, into these low budget solutions that will affect so many people than I've been able to affect before is deeply satisfying. So for right now, these 2 nonprofits are really thrilling to me. And I'm hoping that, we have several crises going on simultaneously. And I think housing, social equity, climate really need to be addressed in the way that we build things. And I'm hoping that keep moving that needle. And that along.
Well, and the projects you're describing have overlap in all those. That's where our architecture can impact each of these spheres in terms of people's lives and the climate. So it's really, really great to hear. Well, thank you, Jasmit. It's been so wonderful to talk to you and catch up, and we'll have to figure out when we can get together and see each other in person.
Yeah, I would love that. Thank you so much, Marc.
Thank you. Great talking to you.